So first of all, welcome to everyone. I thought I knew about the worst excesses of the oil industry, such as Shell's dreadful exploitation of the Niger Delta and their treatment of the Ogoni people, and all the various oil spills from the Torrey Canyon and Exxon Valdez to the Deep Horizon. But I was surprised when I read the book, Crude Britannia, if you haven't got a copy, just how deeply embedded the relationship was between oil and government. And it involves so many revolving doors that I got giddy even reading it. Terry and James have done a brilliant job, I think, in the way in which they explore how the oil industry helped to shape and also used the popular culture that I grew up with, and including the fetishization of the car and of hypermobility and the so-called freedoms that attached itself to that. And it made me really think about my upbringing, my teenage years and early 20s, and how much of that might have been shaped by that. So thank you both for that. And this book is really timely, and James and Terry's talk is really timely, given the announcement of the government on how it's going to try and achieve carbon zero by 2050. And it's just recommending product substitution, as far as I can tell, replacing fossil fuel driven cars with electric ones, replacing mega nuclear power stations with mini nuclear power stations, and without questioning the underpinnings of how we live, let alone proposing any changes to that. In 2019, I think we had, the Labour Party had a much better response to the climate crisis and to other environmental and social crises that are hitting us all the time, involving working less, travelling less, distributing resources much better. CLEF is very pleased to host this evening's talk and to welcome all of you. We meet quite regularly to discuss socialist environmental ways in which we can address these problems, primarily locally, but also regionally and sometimes nationally. And I think we require the kind of major cultural shift that oil was able to make in the 50s and 60s, but we need to make it to challenge this culture of hypermobility and fossil fuel dependence, which is a big ask. James and Terry have been working in this area for a long time, investigating the oil industry, writing about it as activists. And Terry, as many of you will know, is one of CLEF's key activists as well. So I'm going to hand over to Terry and James to talk about the work that underpins their book, and then to open that up into a discussion as to perhaps what we might be able to do to try and address the problems we face. So thanks very much. Over to you.
Okay, I think there was a possibility of us just playing a 40-second video. Thank you very much, Sue, for that very kind introduction, and Cambridge Labour Party Environment Forum for inviting myself and James to speak about the book at a very important juncture in the run-up to the COP26 climate talks. It's a great pleasure for me to be here as a kind of home fixture. I'm a big fan of the campaigning CLEF does. It's a wonderful biosphere of ideas, practical, creative, and even imaginary. And I'm thinking there at the end about the rites of the River Cam ritual, which was undertaken by friends of the River Cam, some of whom are here, which is very nice, in which CLEF was a co-founder of that organization and plays a leading role. And Crude Britannia too is a mixture of history, the present day, and future thinking. We'll read you a couple of passages, one after I've finished speaking, and I'll talk for about 15 minutes maximum, and then James will read a little extract, and then we'll have a discussion, hopefully, and hear your ideas. And then at the end, we'll finish off with another passage from James, which is a sort of our version of a futuristic vision of how life could be post-oil. James is a friend, he's a comrade, and he's the co-author. He's a writer, artist, and a campaigner with a platform collective, and he's co-author of 3 other books. I'm a freelance writer, I'm the former energy editor of The Guardian and an industrial correspondent there, and I've lived in Cambridge for 13 years. And as Sue said, both of us have been around this subject a long time, rather frighteningly, 60 years between us. We've either sort of been bumped into the oil industry to write about it or campaign around the issues of social justice and environmental degradation. And we both we'd been talking as contacts. James had provided me, and I was on The Guardian, with a lot of help. And we'd been talking about writing a book, both of us individually, and we thought collectively we really could and should do something quite important if we put our mind to it. So we thought it would take about 18 months. It took 5 years. It took 5 years. But it's certainly not through lack of. There is no lack of effort and attention paid to it. So the strapline for the book is How Oil Shaped a Nation, and we were keen to explore how oil had influenced the politics and the economics, but also the culture of Britain, which Sue alluded to in her introduction. But we also wanted, as a flip side to that, to show how Britain had changed in the period since the Second World War. And we thought that you could use oil as a lens through which you could track those changes. So Crude Britannia is a journey, an intellectual one, as it were, where we seek to explore the depth of influence imposed by the oil industry on the body politic, on Westminster and elsewhere. But it's also a physical journey, and we construct the story visiting 4 key regions that have played a particularly important role in the oil story, and that is the northeast of Scotland, Merseyside, South Wales, and the Thames estuary, which in our mind touches on Cambridge. Now, this is the city some of you, myself, reside, and few would think about Cambridge as an oil centre. It's a centre of learning and big data. But in fact, it's also an energy node. It's a consumer of oil direct from the Thames refineries, but also the city's intellectual capital can be seen as a lubricant of oil production. It's no surprise that the largest oil services companies in the world, like Schlumberger, have big research arms here out on the West Campus. And big data from Silicon Fen is also a major importance to the oil industry. And as XR has highlighted in some of the activities they've been involved in the city, there's no lack of oil money swilling around the different departments of the university. And there's a roster of oil alumni coming out of here. No great surprise that Lord Brown, John Brown, the most high profile of all the BP executives in the 20th century, was until recently chair of the Judge Business School here in Cambridge. So we spent 5 years researching the book, and we burnt a lot of shoe leather because we wanted to have a lot of on-the-spot reportage contained in the book, not just kind of rehashed stuff out of The Guardian or elsewhere. We wanted original material, and it is largely full of original material. We tracked down senior politicians. We also met up with corporate bosses like Ben van Beurden, the chief executive of Shell in The Hague, and super secretive oil traders in the Surrey Hills who were surprisingly willing to give us access to their homes. We talked to former technicians, refinery workers, trade unionists, as well as renewable power entrepreneurs, climate activists, filmmakers and musicians. And with relation to film, we've been helping some Scottish filmmakers led by Emma Davey in Edinburgh to make a documentary for the BBC called The Black, Black Oil, and that'll be aired on November the 3rd. We're also going to have an event on the 7th in Glasgow where we'll show the film and we'll have a discussion which I will chair. So arts, the creative side of the industry, the impact from oil, it's important to us to explore that. It's also important to us on a personal level. And there is actually a soundtrack that goes with this book, which you can find on the Pluto website, a Spotify one. And these are songs that are influenced by the oil industry, like Paradise by Wilko Johnson, or Stanlow, which is a hymn to an oil refinery by orchestral manoeuvres in the dark. But there's also references in the book to car culture in literature, books like Crash by J.G. Ballard, Autogeddon by Heathcote Williams. Crude Britannia is not a heavy academic book. We didn't want that. Our target audience is wide. We certainly wanted to appeal to young people. We were guided early on in our thinking by an interview that we did with Helen Thompson, who's a professor of politics at the university here in Cambridge. She said, I think it's difficult for people to think about oil. It's almost like a parallel world because it's so big, it permeates everything. So the oil industry may be quite visible on your high street. If I look out of my window up here, I can almost see a Shell garage. But in other ways, it's hidden from plain sight. The oil industry hates publicity. It never wants to be seen publicly influencing government. But we would actually argue it actually doesn't need to be seen because the oil is embedded in the psyche of ministers and parts of the body politic, which I mentioned earlier. Certainly there's been a wafer-thin gap between UK government foreign policy and the needs of oil and gas companies. Britain's colonial involvement in Nigeria, in Trinidad, in Kuwait, and other places attest to this. By the way, Priyamvada Gopal, a professor of post-colonial studies, again in this city at the university, makes interesting references to the role of striking Trinidadian oil workers in her wonderful book, Insurgent Empire. Iran and Iraq, much more associated in the public mind with oil, certainly part of Britain's informal empire. Was the invasion of Iraq a war for oil? Well, there was certainly no Western talk of liberating other known dictatorships, such as Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe. So we show in the book the way that North Sea oil was used as a laboratory for pro-privatization, anti-trade union free market policies of Margaret Thatcher and the role it played in the miners' strike. Equally, we highlight the role of oil in the deindustrialization which helped fuel a Brexit vote in some parts of the country, certainly the Thames Estuary and South Wales, which we visited. We reveal the way the traditional oil majors such as BP and Shell are also changing and morphing into, they're moving towards a different kind of way of operating. They're selling off assets. They're trying to appeal to the public that they are indeed on their own energy transition. But in doing so, they're selling off their assets to a new breed of unaccountable, even more unaccountable, private equity and foreign state-owned backed companies such as INEOS and Siccar Point Energy, which is wanting to develop the Cambo oil field with Shell. And it's interesting that INEOS has hired a new executive from BP who says his new employer is keen to buy up assets being sold by his old employer, BP. So what does this mean for climate campaigning? Well, this current period, when the revolving door between government and business is under media scrutiny like never before, it's very important. It was the Cameron government, the one that gave a desk to Lex Greensill, which has created all this kerfuffle around insider influence, which first invited oil industry executives, in fact, industrialists generally, into the cabinet, with Lord Brown being made a lead non-executive director of the cabinet in 2010. This was billed at the time as a way of making government and civil service more efficient, more business-like, but it also put carbon at the top table of policy making. And it was not long before Lord Brown brought in his former head of refining, John Manzoni, and he rose to be chief executive of the civil service. Many other BP executives followed, including Tony Meggs and Vivienne Cox. In the opposite direction, we see former Defence Secretary, Lord Robertson, now acting as a consultant to BP, while Sir John Sawers, ex-head of MI6, also sits on the board of BP. Former defence advisor to the Prime Minister, Sir Nigel Sheinwald, has been on the Shell board for 10 years. Many of the senior politicians worked for oil companies in the past. Liz Truss, former Secretary of State for International Trade, now Foreign Secretary, worked for Shell, as did former Minister of State for Europe, Alan Duncan. Former Lib Dem leader Vince Cable was the chief economist at Shell, while ex-Armed Services Minister Lord Robattom worked for BP. And even the sort of esteemed think tanks like Chatham House in the foreign international affairs area is full of oil men acting as senior advisors. The point we make in the book is that this cocktail mix of government and fossil fuels threatens to allow big oil to set the parameters for energy policy. Britain has reduced its carbon emissions, and it's keen to boast about that in recent years. But a lot of it has been done by outsourcing manufacturing and therefore carbon emissions to China, and by closing down coal-fired generating plants rather than touching North Sea oil and gas. Equally, you can see BP and Shell currently pushing carbon capture plants so that oil can keep flowing and that natural gas can be used to make hydrogen or other alternative fuels. And while we show how the big oil men get endless face-to-face meetings with government, and that's very well documented, we talk to people in the book like Mark Shorrock, who was trying to set up an alternative energy project, Swansea Bay Tidal Lagoon. He found similar access impossible. So we also in this book track the environment movement and the key role played by women. It's a book about oil, it's about a book about people, and it's also a book about place and renewable energy. So what conclusions do we come to? Well, clearly we in nature are badly served by the current phase of high octane capitalism and the environmental degradation and inequality that it produces. New forms of ownership, democratic, governmental and community-based, are needed inside the energy system to make sure it works for our future, not for immediate profit. Oil is on the defensive. Indeed, the Pro-Oil International Energy Agency declared recently it was time to stop drilling. But companies and governments with vested interests and oil coursing through their veins will not go down without a fight. So finally, we see the current chaos of petrol queues, soaring gas prices. This really has made us aware of the fragility of the energy system. Market-based mechanisms have removed buffer stores on the basis of efficiency. It should make it easier to campaign for renewables, which are not subject to wide commodity price fluctuation and manipulation. But equally, it will make politicians and the public worry about the energy transition, supply disruption, shortages, and rising costs. Are the energy companies deliberately taking advantage of the big bounce back in energy demand post-COVID? Well, you can bet your bottom dollar the traders are making a fortune, and all the big oil companies have massive trading departments, which they rarely talk about. As to this week's announcements on heat pumps, net zero, there is no talk of demand reduction, just supply initiatives. This is how the companies like it. That is where the money is. The other major question now is who pays for this energy transition, as governments warn that £37 billion worth of annual petrol tax will disappear. But it's clear who they have in mind, us. So COP26 will be enormously difficult, but you already know that. Politicians will want to grandstand, look for quick PR hits, and make as little active progress as possible. The need for popular pressure remains as strong as ever, and we can all play a part in that. So we believe that Crude Britannia is a social and political history, it's a travelogue, but it's also a climate action handbook, which should help you on your way. And it was utterly delightful to hear Junaid Islam from Cambridge School's Eco Council using background from our book in a recent speech that he made last week. That was what we had in mind when we started this book, and we were utterly delighted. Thank you very much. And now ask James if he will read us a chunk of the text. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Terry. And I'd like to read a short passage of about 6-7 minutes, which perhaps gives the story behind things like the Shell garage in Newnham Road or the BP garage in Newmarket Road. And I begin with some of the lyrics for a song by PJ Harvey. Goddamn Europeans, take me back to beautiful England and the grey, damp filthiness of ages, and battered books and fog rolling down behind the mountains, on the graveyards and Dead Sea captains. Let me walk through the stinking alleys to the music of drunken beatings, past the River Thames, glistening like gold, hastily sold for nothing. First, we visit the ruins. We follow the manorway down through Corringham towards the river's edge. This road was once busy with petrol tankers. Those that were laden ground up the hill, and those that were empty passed them as they rushed towards the refinery to refill. It was a constant back and forth, bees coming and going from the hive, day and night ceaselessly. Now the road is almost empty of traffic. As we drive from the ridge, the estuary is laid out before us, fields, scraps of marshland, and beyond, the wide brown Thames merging with the sea. The tide is far out, and there are a few vessels in the shipping channel. The Kent Hills to the south are sleepy grey forms. Between the 1940s and the 2000s, the mouth of the Thames, 50 miles east of London, was Britain's major zone for oil refineries and gas importation docks, similar to the Elbe near Hamburg or the Rhine at Rotterdam. In the 1960s, around 15,000 men and women were employed running 3 refineries, working on building 3 more and operating a couple of gas plants. Storage tanks and chimneys dominated sections of the horizon. The flares and the lights of the plants punctured the night sky. The companies built towns and villages, housing the families who moved in from across the country. Now, after 2 generations, this industry is almost gone. The last refinery closed in 2012. On the drive away from Corriton refinery site, we stop off at a petrol station near Basildon. And after filling up, we ask the woman serving at the till about when the lorries come to resupply the underground storage tanks. She's friendly, but all she knows is that it's a BP tanker that comes in the very early mornings. She's wearing a shirt with the BP logo on it, so we ask if she's employed by the company. She replies, "Oh no, by MFG." Back in the car, aided by a chart we've compiled, we put together a trail of how the unleaded petrol got into our engine. The garage with its BP sign we refilled at is not owned by BP, but MFG, the largest forecourt operator in the UK, itself owned by a US private equity company. It was supplied by a road tanker, which, although it was marked with a BP logo, was owned by XPO Logistics, a US transport multinational. The tanker driver does a circuit of tens of petrol stations west of London and as far north as Cambridge, coming from the Thames oil port at the old Corriton site. This storage depot is owned by Grenergy, a private equity company from London. The Thames oil depot also supplies aviation fuel to Stansted, Gatwick, Heathrow, and RAF bases such as Honington in Suffolk, via the UK's Oil Pipeline Authority. For 60 years, these pipelines were owned by the British state as a matter of national security. Now they're owned by CLH of Spain, whose largest shareholder is CVC, a private equity company registered in Luxembourg. The fuel that is delivered from Thames Oil is supplied to the storage depot by ship, most likely a tanker working for an oil trading corporation such as Vitol, a private company based in Switzerland. The tanker would have arrived from anywhere across the globe, but it could have shipped fuel processed to meet EU standards in the refinery at Haldia in West Bengal, India. Where did the crude that fed that refinery come from? We know that BP has a contract to supply Haldia with oil, but from where it does so is commercially confidential. At this point, the trail has so many variables that we can no longer trace it through the thickets of the industrial world. We talk it all over. So what does all this mean? It means that a decade ago, when these roads were thick with traffic, BP refined fuel at Corriton, and their own road tankers delivered to an array of petrol stations, and we might just have pulled into one of them that belonged to the company. But now, although the traffic is just as heavy, this entire system from a refinery in India to the garage we stopped at is owned and controlled by a mesmerizing array of private equity companies. These firms feast on the ruins left by the closure of BP and Shell's refineries. They've moved in on Britain as the big corporations have slowly moved out. But why is this important if we can still fill up the car? Because these companies are almost all registered abroad, many in tax havens such as Luxembourg or Monaco, and the men who run them are often millionaire tax exiles. For all the talk of the end of fossil fuels, the boom in electric vehicles and the rise of renewable energy, the role of oil in the UK economy remains vitally important. As things return to normal after the pandemic, there are still as many trucks on the road and almost as many planes in the sky. There is still as much plastic in the kitchen and pesticides on the fields. Yet the control of this bloodstream of a society is now in the hands of a very few wealthy men who are entirely hidden from public view, beyond the reach of politicians, trade unions, or civil society groups. Those that own the private equity companies want from Britain the highest return on their capital and the lowest taxes possible, with the least stringent regulations. The last thing they desire is for limits to be put on the sale of fuel as a way of tackling climate change. Whereas the heads of BP, Shell, and other corporations may profess a commitment to decarbonize to appease an alarmed public, the private equity men are hidden from view and pressure. These owners may know next to nothing about the communities such as those in the Thames estuary that live next to their assets like Thames Oil, through which the bloodstream flows. They are certainly not in the business of building homes for their staff like the companies once did at Corriton. And those that work in places like Thames Oil have little job security. It is a submarine industry, and the submarine is diving deeper, further into the deep, partly in response to the pressure of civil society. Our journey is to follow it and to find out how this industry helped build Britain's past and still has a part in shaping Britain's future. we drive on. As we come over the crest of Benfleet Hill on the A130, the Thames estuary fills the view. Down there on the flat land around Corriton are the dirty white cylinders that make up the Thames oil storage facility. Beyond it, moored to a jetty, is the hulk of a tanker pumping fuel into the bloodstream. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terry and James. So if people have questions, if they could either use their electronic hand and unmute when called, or just put a note in the chat. Can I start with a question that links to the private equity companies and also is reinforced by some of the things that were in your quote, James. And I wonder if the success of renewables and kind of electricity as opposed to oil and gas use will be assured once the private equity companies start investing in that rather than fossil fuels. And is that something that we should be concerned about?
Very good question. Shall I have a go, Terry?
Yeah, please do.
Very, very good question. I think the thing that we should remember about private equity companies is that the private equity companies, for example, are invest in oil. They're not interested in oil per se. They're interested in return on capital, and to some extent, the arrival of private equity in this sector is a mark of the sector's slow weakening because of concerns about climate change. I would say it would be deeply concerning if the private equity sector becomes more heavily involved in the renewable sector, because what we don't need in the renewable sector is churn. And we don't need volatility. What we need is long-term stability. We need long-term projects, projects which set up for generations to deal with this question, because as everybody knows, the moving out of fossil fuels and in dealing with climate change is not a short-term project. It's a project of centuries. And the thing that a private equity company requires, as do anybody trading in the finance, is churn and volatility. So there's a direct conflict between the needs of security and stability and the needs of capital, which is to create volatility and create churn. And that's why I am concerned by those companies getting into that sector. And I don't think the current government's proposals alleviate that situation at all. In fact, they make it worse. But did you want to say anything, Terry?
Well, I don't think I particularly want to talk about private equity necessarily, but as an interesting side reference to one of the things we look at in the book is the way that the renewable energy industry has replicated some of the patterns that we've seen, negative patterns that we've seen with oil. I mean, one of the great regrets to me is the failure of Britain to take an active role, a participating stake, public stake in the renewable energy sector, which I think is vital if we're to actually transit to a low carbon future. But you know, the fact is that it has been foreign companies, it's been foreign operators, it's been foreign investment funds, it's been foreign supply companies that have built out what the government is now boasting about, which is Britain having the world leading offshore wind industry, which it does have, but it's been entirely done kind of out with the UK. And it's a sort of, you know, it's a terrible, it's just such a terrible social waste that the British workforce has not been suitably involved, that British capital has not been involved, that British research and knowledge has not been built out of that sector. So it's a sort of side issue about the corporatization patterns of renewable energy. But yeah, certainly James is absolutely right. These guys are, the private equity side of the business is interested in churn, interested in volatility, interested in a quick buck, and has no interest in sticking around or some wider social purpose. And so, yes, I too would share those enormous concerns.
Thank you. So questions from the floor.
Terry, how have you taken any view on how this change in investment away from the big companies to these small guys is going to affect environmental risk? For example, in the North Sea, these small companies are moving in and taking over the assets, the aging assets of the large companies. And these things are supposed to be, when production is finished, they're supposed to be removed safely. And I can't see that these private equity companies are going to want to do that. And I think they're going to try and get out of doing it if they possibly can. And that could, in my view, create a huge environmental risk of spills and accidents and all sorts of things. I don't know whether you've thought about that at all.
Yeah, absolutely. We take a look at that. I mean, certainly the way risk is put into the public realm. The business sector, the private business sector, loves that. To de-risk themselves by forcing responsibility onto the public sector. And so they did this deal with the Tory government where they offloaded 50% of the responsibility for decommissioning offshore platforms onto the public purse. I mean, that was never part of the original deal. It could have been written into the original agreements whereby oil companies took licenses and stakes in the North Sea. Instead, late in the day, they suddenly sort of say, oh, well, this is all very difficult for us. The North Sea is running down. We're not making the kind of profits we were. We can't afford to decommission these things. So, you better take it over. And they bludgeoned the government pathetically into taking a 50% stake. That's a separate issue from what you're talking about, absolutely rightly, is these much smaller entities who have astonishing names like Acorn Oil, which doesn't sort of give you a feeling of grandeur or financial stability, who are taking over these wells and fields. And what does happen at the end of their lifetime, or if something goes wrong, they're much more financially fragile. I mean, ironically, we are chasing the big, well-heeled oil majors out of the North Sea, and they're disposing of their assets to these tiny companies often who are could be in a fragile state. In theory, when it comes to selling those assets, the sellers have got to take some responsibility for decommissioning. So in theory, it stays with them, but it becomes that much more fragile. And I would have enormous concerns that, yes, the environmental damage left by the oil companies is in danger of remaining. This is a particular issue that's come up in the likes of Nigeria, where we quote in the book a guy called Lazarus Tamana, who's involved with the Ogoni people, and he expresses his enormous concern about the degradation that Sue also mentioned earlier in the Ogoni Niger Delta. The companies like Shell are indeed talking about pulling out, but there is no decommissioning or reparation of the enormous damage that has been done to those communities and that biosphere.
Thanks, that was very helpful.
Thank you. There's a question from Tim Hardy. Tim, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Sue. I
Yeah.
was attending a webinar this morning and someone came up with the figure that US $4 trillion was needed if governments worldwide were to fulfill their renewable energy ambitions and emission reduction targets. If we don't have the funds to fund and meet these ambitions, how else are we our governments to get them other than by involvement with the private equity markets? And I just posed the question to Terry and James, is regulation arbitrage not a 21st century fact of life, little as we welcome it? The observation was made that having members of fossil fuel boards at the table of governments is deemed to be a bad thing if they're shaping policy. But as you mentioned, if BP and Shell were to be replaced of old with private equity, offshore tax haven hiding entities, are the villains of the piece not going further underground?
Right, come back to that. Can I say that, Terry? Thank you, Tim. I think for me, the nub of the thing lies in the question of supply and demand. It's very interesting when you look at Terry touched it very briefly on it in his introduction. When you look at much of the discussion of the government's proposals in the last couple of days, in the green proposals, it all focuses on supply. It all focuses on where do we get our energy from? Are we going to get it from nuclear? Are we going to get it from more wind farms? Are we going to get it from carrying on drilling for oil and so on? There's virtually no discussion really about demand. There's an attempt to explore replacement of demand, like through heat pumps, but there's no attempt to reduce demand. If you wanted to reduce demand, you would absolutely focus on insulating houses and homes and businesses. That's the way you'd reduce energy use. You'd absolutely focus on building a transport system which would stop people using cars. And that's where you'd put your capital. The thing that is tragic, I think, is that if we look at the role of the energy companies, of oil companies particularly, whether they're the major corporations or the private equity companies, if they have a political stake, if they're involved in the policy, they're always doing the same thing, which is basically driving supply. They don't want to drive down demand, they want to drive supply. They want to make sure that people carry on needing energy, whether or not it's oil or it's electricity. So we need to take those players out of the discussion as much as we can, so we can focus on the real thing, which is actually reducing the amount of energy we use. Sue, you mentioned this right at the beginning. You know, we've all of us of a certain age in this discussion, I see from all the heads here, all of us have grown up in a hypermobile, hyper energy use society, right from the 40s, 50s, 60s onwards. And that hyper energy use society needs to change. And the key to the changing that is not just replacing, but reducing demand, reducing the amount of energy we're using, attacking demand rather than just dealing with the question of supply.
Can I just follow that on? I don't think, I mean, my personal view would not be that private cash is not needed. You know, I'm sort of very happy for the Ottawa pension funds and the Danish pension funds to invest in offshore wind, which they do. I'm wondering why British pension funds don't. That's another complicated question. But I'm not suggesting personally that the private cash has nothing to do with the future of the energy transition. But I am suggesting that there needs to be a much more holistic response, partly what James is talking about, the reduction in demand, and partly by a kind of much more muscular state involvement, whereby they can, or we can, impose a certain discipline and social need as well as a commercial need. I mean, it's worth pointing out that Britain spends £40 billion a year on military issues, on the defence. That is the defence budget. That is an enormous amount of money. And there's certainly no point in having Trident submarines or even Type 31 destroyers if you can't actually keep the lights on in the port and in a clean way, and that the whole environment is being degraded to incineration. So, you know, I think it's a mixture of private and public cash, but I think the private equity companies are very, very unpredictable. And yeah, you know, I don't think they're part of a kind of responsible social culture that is needed to do the kind of project that we've got to do.
Thank you. Claire, you have a question. Would you like to ask that?
Hi. Yeah, so I just sort of listening to the horror story that you've told and the shocking fact of how you know, how these people are insulated from, actually also from a lot of sort of political action in a lot of ways. I just wonder, you know, it has been said since the last market crash that there will be another one. We all know that the financial system's built on a house of cards. And I'm just thinking whether you've thought that through. What happens? I mean, what's supposed to be important is the ideas lying around are taken up, so that we have a kind of coherent picture of, you know, how we think the world should be. But I just wonder what your response to that is.
Do I have a response to that? I mean, Lord knows then when another financial crash comes, and Lord knows what shape it will be. And I ain't in the business to guess. But what we can do is to look at what was the outcome of the last financial crash. You know, so 2008-9. What I think is very interesting about that is what drove that crash, and who benefited from the crash to some extent. The work that Terry referred to earlier, of a brilliant academic at Cambridge, looking at the crash in detail. She observed the fact that actually the role of oil in provoking the financial crash was not being actively discussed. But the more she looked into the transactions of the Federal Reserve and the transactions of the Bank of England, the more she realized that at every stage you could see that the price of oil was a key driver of the financial crash. And certainly you can see the impact of the crash then immediately upon oil after it. So just before the crash, oil was trading at about 149 dollars a barrel, and after the crash kicked in, it was hitting down to around $30 a barrel. It just went over a cliff. A lot of companies, a lot of the large corporations took quite a hit in that financial crash. But the people who didn't were the oil traders. The oil trading is basically, you know, I mean, put simply, it is not producing oil, not extracting it out of the ground, but buying the oil that somebody else has extracted out of the ground and selling it on to somebody else who's going to refine it, being that middleman, that middle person between the two things. And crucially, speculating on the process of what's the difference in the value when you buy it to the what's the difference in the value when you sell it. And the oil traders did immensely well out of the financial crash. We interviewed several and talk about them in the book. And some of the most powerful and spectacular characters, they did extremely well out of the crash. So the impact of another financial crash on the oil industry is not very easy to predict, but I think it would be wrong to assume that a big financial crash would suddenly bring the industry to a halt, because what it does, at least the last one did, was to bring bits of the industry to a halt, and bits of it profited enormously.
I'm not totally clear, Claire, of what you were sort of trying to get at in terms of if there was another crash like 2008. What's your concern about what the implications are for this energy transition? Or
yeah, well, James actually did a really good job of answering, because that was kind of what I was getting at. I was thinking, you know, would it, since this is such a kind of financial business, would it bring the oil companies to their knees, kind of thing? And if it did, we need the political idea, you know, the political instability that results from a financial crash. It's very good from a political point at that point to have your sort of set of ideas at what we're going to do in place, which is what happened, you know, when the sort of where neoliberalism first sort of, you know, took off, was because those ideas were lying around in the 70s. So, but that's like different. I was kind of interested in the financial aspect, and of course it's really depressing that what happened is the oil traders did really, really well.
yeah, I mean, the more immediate example is COVID and the extraordinary situation, which, as I say, James and I have followed this industry combined for about 60 years. Never have we seen oil prices at a minus value. Oil prices hit zero. They actually hit a minus value in the States. And it was a catastrophic period for the oil producers and refiners. It was absolutely fantastic for the oil traders. They've made record profits. Last year, the sort of pandemic, COVID, everything, the collapse of the world of work almost, and the oil traders came out very handsomely. And traditionally, people have thought of the oil traders as these kind of Mark Rich type names that you hear about for all sorts of skullduggery or whatever. But actually, the oil companies themselves have got massive trading arms that the big oil companies like BP and Shell, that they don't like to talk about, that it's very hard to find any reference to it in their annual accounts. Certainly they never talk about it at annual general meetings, but it is part of their business. And it's an interesting question as to whether the oil companies, James picked up a really, really interesting thing today, that he saw a Strutton Parker reference, an estate agent reference to the fact that BP had just taken a massive new slug of space down at Canary Wharf. Well, Canary Wharf, at the same time, they're talking about closing their headquarters in Berkeley Square, which is, this is, we've got to retrench people working at home. So what are you doing extending your Canary Wharf offices? Canary Wharf is the epicenter of trading. And it's an interesting question now that we must explore, to what extent the oil companies are moving out of assets to appease the public pressure, and actually ramping up their trading operations where they can make money without any of the heat that is generated from owning oil fields and oil wells.
Thanks, Terry and James. Anna has the next question, but it's also an interesting point from Alan in response to your responses to the last question, just for everyone to note. But Anna, thank you. your question.
You said that private equity is only interested in capital return. If the renewable sector leads to energy stability and generates massive returns, are we then to expect private equities to take over?
I don't think. I mean, this is. I think it's a very interesting area. It's an extremely interesting area, which is, will the renewables sector, when we really become a renewables-based economy, not just a percentage of it as it is now, but in the future, will that actually shift the way in which money is made, the way in the whole structure of capital? Because if you look historically, you can see that there is a relationship to the development of finance and the coal industry in the 18th century. There's a development of the development of finance and the oil industry in the early 20th century. There are certain structures of finance that evolve out of these energy systems. And it's a really interesting question in my mind as to whether, if we flip 20, 50, 60 years into the future, in which all of the industry, all energy systems are renewables, whether actually we'll have seen a slightly different evolution of how money works and the economy works. Because there are some very, very fascinating differences between wind as an energy source and oil as an energy source. And one is actually is the very obvious thing about the name of the thing, renewable, which is when you pull a barrel of oil out of the ground in, say, deep water off of Shetlands or deep water in the Caspian Sea, it's not replaced, it's finite, it's gone. You pull it out of the ground, you refine it. And I know this is a rather obvious thing to say, but when a wind turbine turns in the Thames estuary, the wind that turns it may already have turned a turbine in Holland, may already have turned a turbine in Germany, may already have turned a turbine in Poland. There's a sense of this energy system flowing through a whole set of structures. And that's for me, it indicates the sense in which we actually may be inching towards a different way of thinking about not only energy, but the entire structure of our economy, which is based not on finite, the obvious finite nature of the resources that we do, but the more subtle, infinite nature of the resources that we use. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, I think it's very hopeful. The reason I asked it in the way I asked it was I didn't want you to say yeah.
yeah. No, I think there's some very interesting subtle things. A barrel of oil that comes from Azerbaijan belonged originally to Azerbaijan. The wind that turns the turbine in the Thames estuary previously had turned it elsewhere. Who does it belong to? And that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Thanks, Anna. Joe, would you like to ask your question?
Sorry, I have to put my microphone on and put my glass down. You've both been talking about the importance of demand reduction, which I completely understand. But we've all grown up in the same culture, and I recognise your description of a hyper-energized culture. How do we make that cultural shift? Where do we even begin? What are the first steps towards? Because it's the change towards, the difference between my life and my grandmother's life and all of our grandmothers, I'm sure, but is extraordinary. And what are we asking people to do in terms of quality of life? And how do we put that across in a way that becomes acceptable.
Do you want?
Yeah, I'll say something. I mean, you're right. It's a massive question, isn't it? My frustration in the past would be that there's never really been any attempt by policymakers to open up this debate. And you know, if you're of a suspicious nature, you would say that, you know, that there's nothing in it for sort of capitalism or whatever. We're talking about a completely different way of being, and obviously many environmentalists and the sort of people who are interested in this whole subject obviously end up looking to other kinds of ways of living, and those exist on this planet. The Aboriginal communities quite clearly have a completely different approach to life, a completely different attitude towards the natural world around them, have a much more respectful and responsible attitude towards the environment. And, you know, I mentioned in that introductory talk that CLEF and Friends of the River Cam had been involved in the rights of the river. And, you know, there is no legal rights in this country that you can give to the river. This was a sort of symbolic action. But in parts of Canada and New Zealand, Aboriginal communities have won the legal right to protect their rivers. And so we were kind of following through on that. I mean, we have seen with COVID and the pandemic response that the world can change. A Tory government that was obsessed with cutting public expenditure suddenly discovered mountains of money to spend in different ways. But on the flip side, you know, it's a sort of cliche that a lot of people felt they discovered nature for the first time. They had time in lockdown, or those few occasions where they could go out the house, that they suddenly realized the importance of different things out with consumption and hypermobility. And those things were nature, their family, the natural world generally. And so there is scope for that. But my personal view is that governments have never really tackled cultural thinking. They've never really, you know, which, as XR talk about, tell the truth. The truth is that this kind of overconsumption, hypermobile society is screwing the planet, and we either change or we're finished. And so it's just a matter of speed, and when that reckoning comes, and when we accept that we need to do things in a very different way.
I'd just like to add, I think that in some ways we have the strange good fortune to have experienced something which nobody could have imagined we would experience. Everybody on this call has experienced the same thing, which is the experience of COVID, the pandemic. None of us could have imagined that was going to happen, and the shock of it was quite amazing. I think for me, what was fascinating about it, I have friends who found it very difficult. They found it very distressing. Some people found it actually very pleasurable. But the experience of it was a change in the structure of feeling, a change in the structure of thinking. We actually felt things differently. Either we might have felt more depressed or more oppressed, or we might have felt more liberated and more sensory in relation to the natural world. But the key of the thing is that our sense of feeling changed, and the structure of thinking changed for a period of time. And for me, that shift of when we talk about energy demand reduction, that frames it a bit too closely in a sort of technological way, a kind of kilojoules way. The key is to change our structure of thinking and our structure of feeling. That's hard, but it can be done, you know.
It has been done. We've lived through it.
We've
So,
lived through it, and we also understand how how the change of structure of feeling and thinking in relation to each other, in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, is radically different than it was for our grandparents. You know, and we're able to, they might not shift enough, but we are, as human beings, able to shift our thinking.
Oh, we are. Yeah. But yes, it's where we start, I think. But I'm curious about how we, in a sense, facilitate. Because as you said, the COVID changes, we changed in a way for a short time.
I mean,
how do we retain that?
One of the things I find is interesting is that, and we explore it in the book, is how does the oil industry, how did they help create a different structure of thinking in the 20s and 30s? I would sum it up as the erotics of speed. You know, the erotic experience, the sensuous experience of moving fast, of the engine, of the car, and that is what was the key shift.
So can we find the erotics of slow? The erotics of
maybe. Yeah.
What's the old? Yeah, we need to find an alternative, equally popular, erotic, for want of a better word, to sell. And which is is about next. Sorry, my partner's making all sorts of gestures in terms of the erotics of the slow. But yes, it's finding something that's because I'm sure you're right, actually. I hadn't thought about it like that, but the erotics of speed makes a lot of sense to me. So what's the 21st century version of the erotics of speed, I suppose, is my question. Is it about slow? Is it about nature? Is it about something completely different? But
Sue, you were muted.
Sue, you're muted. And that was my hand, not Anna's.
I was just not sorry. Tony, you have a question.
Okay. Well, I was going to ask something quite parochial, because you spoke a little bit about, Terry, about the connection between the university and the oil industry. And I don't think this figures particularly prominently in your book, but I was thinking, can we imagine a role that a university with such influence as the University of Cambridge could actually have in decarbonizing? And when you think that there's an institution with a lovely bright new building about 100 meters from where I am at this moment, being built for the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, which has been in business for 30 years. And you think there was this new structure set up a couple of years ago called, I think it's called Cambridge Zero. And what do we say about the role that these kinds of institutions have played in the past? Because clearly it hasn't been directed towards sustainability, and the role that they might play in the future.
That's an interesting question, isn't it? I think it's the same as I mentioned Professor Gopal and her work on decolonialization, which has caused immense pain to the likes of Churchill College, and led to the sort of Daily Mail getting extremely exercised about what's going on in Cambridge. But I think, it's the same kind of thing. There needs to be a decolonialization process in Cambridge around fossil fuels and around power and money. And I too share your enormous reservations about this kind of biosphere of organizations that seem to spring up when money appears and are willing to sort of put their hand to almost any kind of research, as long as it's paid for. And it's been, I mean, we've done a lot of work on this, all of us, no doubt, around CLEF and all the sort of climate action around Cambridge, is this kind of complete, almost incomprehension that a city like this is not at the absolute epicenter of greening and decarbonisation, that it's got so much to offer, both as a city, being a very green city, being one where it's naturally flooded with cyclists. It's got climate change departments coming out of more than one university, and loads of engineering departments and things. So a lot of academics here are doing fantastic work. But culturally, institutionally, there seems to be a clinging on to legacy power and legacy money. And, you know, it's true to say the legacy money is, you know, has been with the fossil fuel industry and renewables. There aren't companies really, or there haven't been until recently, of the scale of these huge oil companies that can invest so much in financial institutions, in cultural organizations like the British Museum, like Tate, like the Science Museum, and all the controversy they bring. So, you know, yes, Cambridge should be absolutely at the center of futuristic thinking and the green revolution and the energy transition. And the only explanation for why it isn't is because it's attached financially or culturally to legacy money and legacy way of doing things.
And it's at the epicenter of high emissions, unsustainable growth through its ownership of land and its opportunity for the opportunities it sees for development. So you can see there too that it's just not in their thinking at the moment.
The kind of issues that we talk about in terms of the book and in terms of the changes of the oil industry, not the sort of more recent stuff around private equity so much, but we track the financialization, the neoliberal revolution that took place, which I mentioned about the North Sea as a neoliberal laboratory. Those kind of changes can be seen also in academia, the financialization of academia. And it's particularly pronounced in Cambridge, where, as you say, this is one of the biggest, the colleges, not the university itself, as they will always tell you, the colleges, or a handful of colleges, are amongst the biggest landowners in Britain and are massive developers and make a lot of money out of property development. And obviously all of us who live in Cambridge are deeply aware of the growth agenda, who is driving it. And in the same way as climate change and attached to climate change is this in the interests of quality of life for people who actually live in the city, for the river and the wider species world? The answer quite obviously is no.
I think for me, just to pick up on something, which is there is a very, very acute relationship, a long history, a century of relationship between Cambridge and the oil industry. The best way to quickly get a grasp of that is to read the 4 volumes of the history of the British Petroleum Company, or the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is published by the Cambridge University Press and written by a guy called Jim Bamberg, who lives in Newnham, and a brilliant book. really fascinating. One of the things he illustrates is the fact that if you look at the makeup of the board in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, it's very predominantly Cambridge men. It's amazing. So actually, amazingly tightly came out of a set of colleges at Cambridge University. And for my mind, there's something interesting about it, which is that, you know, there's plenty of things that we do in our lives which are to do with our hands, the physical processes, the making of bread, the growing of food in a garden. Somebody was mentioning their allotment earlier, the caressing of somebody else's cheek. All of these things, they're physical things to do with our hands. If we look at something like the oil industry, and they don't hold this, you know, there are many, many parts of human life which are like this. It's an entirely mental process. It comes out of an intellectual process. I've studied, for my sins, I've studied a great deal, for example, drilling in the Caspian Sea. Deep, the area that they're drilling in, it's a mile deep. The area, the rocks that they're pulling it from is another mile underground, under the seabed. No human being ever gets to see those rocks. It's just a mental experience. And so in many ways, if we understand that the construction of this massive process of drawing carbon out of the belly of the earth, utilizing it on all these myriad machines and throwing it as far as we can into the atmosphere, that process is an entirely mental process. It came out of thinking. It came out of creations that took place, for example, in Cambridge University. We have to think ourselves out of it, and we have to feel ourselves out of this construction of culture. And the role of the university, or the role of universities, the role of Cambridge in this, is crucial. We have to inspect it. One of the things that Terry talked about is the decoloniality of the process of the academy, trying to understand how is it that Cambridge, for example, is built on the colonial structures, and how did it help create colonialism? Let's understand what happens if we apply the same process. How did this university build the structures of fossil fuel extraction, and how was it built out of it? In the same way we understand it built the empire or whatever.
Thanks, James. Just trying to give voice to people who haven't asked questions yet. Monica, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, hello, good evening. I sort of formulated a question in my head, and then, you know, I've been listening to what people have been saying. So, yeah, I don't know if it's sort of still relevant, but this idea of reducing demand, I think is really important. And yet, I think I would say that for all normal people, if I can use that phrase, normal people, I think it's not an issue. Okay, we can all rationalize, or we can understand that we need to use less or do less, and we can accept that. Unfortunately, the people who are making the decisions are often not, again, if I could use the inverted commas, normal. They're quite often, you've got people who, for them, no amount of wealth is enough. And I think it's kind of almost an illness. And then when they have this wealth, they use it and they subvert policy with this wealth. And it's still very much, the discourse is still very much about growth. Everything is about growth, you know. And now to somehow make it feel less, if you like, sort of with a nod to the environmentalists, is now called sustainable growth. Well, I actually think sustainable and growth is an oxymoron. It's just they're completely opposite. If you want to be sustainable, then you actually now need degrowth. when you look at the collapse of biodiversity and things like that, the only way we can really restore things is by using less, by reducing demand, by having a smaller footprint on the planet. But I'm just not very optimistic. People here seem to be quite optimistic that we can somehow change the way people think and change things. I just think unless we can free ourselves of these greedy few and the way they control things, then I'm just not very optimistic.
Well, I certainly share your concerns, and I don't think that anything almost appalls me more than the current sort of oligarch space race, sort of Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson. Seems to me, you know, the absolute apex of human idiocy and corruption of our position on the planet, and the fact that these two are the kind of ultra rich that you're talking about. You know, it's grotesque to me that that's happening. I leave it open whether we can do enough, whether us humans can change quick enough. But I certainly do believe that it is in us inherently, going back to what I was saying about lockdown and nature, that we're not inherently obsessed with consumerism, but we are surrounded and flooded with it. And that apex of power with these oligarchs at the top, as you say, who want to spend their money either on a space race or subverting politics to their own sort of twisted ends, obviously is in the wrong direction. And I come out of the mainstream media. I spent most of my life there. And I'm appalled by the role, the cheerleading that's going on, and the sort of uncritical coverage that we get. And so that needs to change. And I ultimately come down to, you know, it is every man and woman. It's us together. It's us collectively. It's us making the kind of public demonstrations and statements that are going to turn this around. It is not expecting policymakers, business leaders, or the mainstream media to help us at all. They're all consciously or subconsciously caught up in a planet, or certainly human species destroying growth project, which is conceptually completely misguided, and we just have to keep on going and pointing that out over and over and over again until the many just can flood through that control system and media that the few operate.
Thanks. Katie, would you like to ask your question?
Just following up on what Monica was saying is, yes, it's pretty depressing. And I have very little hope about COP26 actually delivering anything near what's needed. And I'm, for those who don't know, I'm a councillor in Cambridge, and I'm leading on the local plan. And it's really, really hard work because we have real aspirations, but we can do so little because of the regulation. And we're trying to make it clear what aspirations there are, but it's so dependent on the government and just holding us back completely. We were better off 10, 15 years ago. It's just got worse and worse with the way it's being done. But one little thing I did want to tell you about is that in the local plan, we are being challenged hugely by all of the sites that didn't get in the local plan. So I know that there are challenges about what has got in, but the universities and the big landowners are furious about the sites that didn't get in. But one of the things I just wanted to mention was about the alternative energy. And one of the things I'm really worried about is solar parks on good farmland. I think this is something I'm really worried about around Cambridge, where there could be investments into solar energy, which wouldn't be wind power, and it would be on farmland, which admittedly is very depleted in nutrition because it's so, there's been so much chemicals used on the farmland. But what we need is regenerative farms around Cambridge. And one of the things I'm going to try really hard to do is stop solar parks on farmland. But I was just going to ask Terry and James, is there any light at the end of this terrible dark tunnel?
James.
Yeah, there's plenty of light. There's plenty of light. I think it's, I mean, Terry's much more equipped to talk about Cambridge than I am, and I admire you for persevering to be a councillor and persevering to be, be involved in the local plan. I think the one observation I would make, which is we sort of touched on in the reading which I did, which is, although it may be depressing, I think it's very helpful. It's important to when doing work on local plans or whatever, to understand the scale of the challenge that we're facing. Who actually operates the energy systems? What is when you talk about a solar park, make the time or put the effort into trying to analyze where does the capital come from for that? There's been a big, I live in North Kent, and there's been a big battle over a solar park near Faversham, if you know that area. And one of the things that's, essentially the battle has been lost, at least temporarily. But one of the things that was very interesting about that was the recognition that pretty quickly, once you scratched away at it, where the capital for that project was basically sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf, Persian Gulf, and it doesn't make it any less depressing. But I think it's important to face those realities, to understand and reveal those things. To say this is where the driver is coming from these for projects like that, and similarly to reveal the structures of power and the structures of capital that lie behind, say, a petrol station in Newmarket Road, or unless we actually see those things, there's a danger that we are constantly outwitted by that power structure. That's I don't feel I've given you a great deal of light, but maybe that's. But
Anna, or possibly John.
It's my hand. I've got a couple of questions which I'd like to put. The first one is about the drive from the oil industry to push blue hydrogen instead of green hydrogen, because it'll give them a reason to keep going. And it seems as if the amount of investment that's going into developing blue hydrogen, effectively hydrogen from fossil fuels, is, as far as I can see, is less than is going into providing green hydrogen, which is effectively hydrogen from water itself. So I'd like to hear your view on that. But my other question, which hasn't really come up yet, and wonder whether you talk about it in your book, is to know to what extent you've had involvement and discussions with any in the trade union movement, either in the trade union movement in this country or with the international trade union movement. It's over the last 50 years, I suppose, the biggest threats to the government in this country have come from the miners' strike, the power workers, if we can go as far back as that, the dockers, possibly even the distribution movement, because the fuel has got to be transported. So all the tanker drivers. Now I know Unite negotiates mainly for the offshore oil stations. But I wonder unless we can get the trade union movement to come alongside, if we can get the trade union movement to come alongside, it's a very much more powerful thing at our disposal. But I wonder where you're at with that.
Can I come in on the trade union side?
Let's talk about that.
I think you're absolutely right. I think the role of the trade unions in the oil and gas sector historically has been very interesting. It should be remembered that it was a tanker strike that was the opening salvo of what is now called the Winter of Discontent. And the road tankers in BP and Shell particularly. And the role of and similarly, events in the oil industry sparked shifts in the structure of the trade unions. So, for example, Piper Alpha led to the setting up of an independent trade union called OILC, the Offshore Industrial Liaison Committee, which was outside the TUC, very radical, and has now more or less come back into the TUC, and it's part of the RMT. So the relationship between the oil industry and the trade unions is extremely interesting, I think. A key thing of this transition is going to be working with the trade unions. And I'm very happy to be together with other colleagues in Platform and other groups as well, like Friends of the Earth Scotland. We've been working closely with the RMT and a bit with Unite to develop worker engagement in a just transition in the North Sea. That means basically working with workers and trade unionists who are involved in the offshore industry in the North Sea to help them out of jobs in the oil and gas and into other forms of employment, not necessarily wind farming, but engaging with the workforce there is absolutely crucial. And to some extent, it's been one of the fact that the environmental movement has not engaged in them has been a great mistake in the last 20 years, I would argue, and a break in the chain, a thing that helped slow up that change. So you're dead right. And I think we have to see a just transition, and we have to see working with the workers in that. What's interesting about the proposals that were put forward by Labour in the manifesto of 2019 was the fact that it was there were just transition elements of that. In the proposals that are being put forward by the Conservative government, not surprisingly, doesn't really involve any worker involvement in the transition.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say we've done talks around the book with organisations like Scott E3, which have very large, I mean, it's a trade union based organisation, and certainly, you know, that coming together, that there is no role for an energy transition without a just transition, I think is absolutely paramount. Totally understandably, there's deep concern in the trade union movement that an energy transition could turn into a kind of miners' route, where communities are, you know, obliterated by policymakers over a change in energy structures. So I do think it's absolutely vital. I do think there's obviously been tension in the past between environmentalists and the trade union movement, certainly around nuclear in this country. That was very that was a big break on environmentalism in many ways, the antagonism between trade unionists who had very good, well-organized, trade union-wise and remunerated jobs, didn't want to be, understandably, just kind of kicked about by how they saw it, by environmentalists who wanted the nuclear industry closed down. But I find that one of the heartening in terms of what is there to feel good about, that there is a dialogue on both sides. The sort of environmentalists are keen to involve the trade union movement and recognize the importance of the situation facing the workers, and the trade union movement is also open to a dialogue, not closed to a dialogue, that there needs to be an energy transition, but it needs to be done in the appropriate way. And yes, as James has just said, the structure, the political structure and the political environment around a Tory government obviously is not encouraging. But in terms of, I expect up at the People's Assembly round the COP26 talks in Glasgow, which James and I will be going to, and we'll be talking about the book and the documentary that I mentioned. I expect to see and talk to a lot of trade unionists as much as environmentalists. In terms of the light, which I didn't comment on, I mean, just the light is provided by the younger generation who if young people just get it. Obviously, they don't have the legacy money that the likes of my generation have, and the legacy power politically that we have. But in terms of, there is no explanations that need to be gone through, as there's no arguments around the need for action. The most younger people just seem to absolutely get it instantly, and a lot of that seems to come from a natural love of the world around them. Animals and nature seems sort of implicit in a childhood experience, and before the onset of consumerism and things that circulate so much more powerfully in one's life later on.
And do you want to say anything on green and blue hydrogen?
Oh yeah, can I? Well, my view is yes. I mean, the hydrogen, as I said in the introduction, blue hydrogen, that's a sort of get out of jail card for the oil companies, as is carbon capture and storage. They are absolutely desperate and no doubt pressurizing government very, very heavily over that hydrogen. They want, in an ideal world, they don't want electrification. It's not something they're familiar with. They want something fossil fuel based, and they are pushing very hard for hydrogen to be used as a fuel for domestic homes rather than electrification and heat pumps and things like that. And yes, you can make hydrogen out of renewable energy. It's considerably more expensive at the moment, but so that's one of the arguments they're using. Let's just start with a bit of blue hydrogen. You can get it. It's a cheap price, and let's get started. Put those pipes in, or use the existing networks and get on with it. But there is an ulterior motive there, and that is to keep fossil fuels flowing and their profits rising. Sorry, James.
No, you said it all.
Thank you. Claire has one last question and has promised to keep it quick. Thanks, Claire.
Hey, it's not a question, actually. It's a piece of information. Talking about the unions, I don't know if you're aware of the COP26 coalition, but it's actually quite exciting, and they are involving the unions. It's the COP26 coalition that's for climate justice. And on November the 6th, they're having this global day of action. And in Cambridge, it's happening all over the place. It's happening in Cambridge too. And in Cambridge, the unions are getting a lot involved, and they're going to bring along their banners. So the unions, I think that is happening. People are trying to mobilize now with the unions. So COP26 coalition is a coalition of environmentalists, unions, and so on. So yeah, just a bit of kind of good news.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks to all the questioners and questions, which has stimulated a really long discussion or Q&A. So we have recorded this, and we will put it up on a YouTube channel, and we will send the link round to you through Eventbrite. And I think those of you who haven't come through Eventbrite, we'll make sure you get that anyway. And a big thanks to James and Terry for talking to us about the book, which has been great and really interesting. And I'm having messages saying that people are going to buy it, which is also great. And if you do buy it, you get a 30% reduction. Details in the chat there. So I don't know, Terry and James, if you want to make any very last statements, but
James?
If not, we will just...
I'll just say thank you very much indeed for coming to this event. Thank you very much for hosting it. It's a pleasure. Thank you, Sue and Tony, for making it happen. And I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to meet with you folks. And maybe it'll be in physical reality at some point. But thank you very much indeed. And I hope that we can do some further things in Cambridge. It's possible the documentary that Terry mentioned is going to be turned into a feature film, which will be touring the country in sort of spring, summer next year. And maybe we can do another event with that. It'll be around about an hour and 10 minutes long. But thank you very much indeed. Good luck to you. Strength to you. Bye-bye.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Bye.